So for these problems, it seems like we can just look at them and discover real or imaginary, but it actually is useful and necessary to show our work. So for letter A, negative 5i, well, nothing can be simplified here. There's nothing to multiply, to distribute. There's nothing to break down like this. So we're just going to look at it and say, there is an I. That I does not go away, so it is imaginary. Here's another example like it. Imaginary also. Also imaginary. Here's another one. Also imaginary. They all have a real number being multiplied. So these are all my real numbers being multiplied by I. So they're not going to cancel. Nothing's going to happen. It'll stay imaginary. Let's look at the next example. Okay, the square root of negative 36, so we'll actually write it out. That's the square root of negative 36. Well, this breaks down if I were to go like this. Okay, that's a perfect square, but the answer is not 6. Recall that when you have a negative inside of our square root, that's actually helpful to rewrite it like this. That's really square root of negative 1 times the square root of 36. And the square root of negative 1, that is I. So when I break this down, the square root of negative 36 is 6i. And now this looks like the problem in A. It is an imaginary number because the negative is inside the square root. Okay, let's do C. Here we have some work to do. It says 5i squared. So I'm going to rewrite this. It's 5i times 5i. Now when I multiply 5i times 5i, the integers, the numbers, the real components multiply together. So that gives me a 25. 5 times 5 is 25. And then I times I, actually, it looks like I'm distributing, but I'm not. Let me rewrite this. So I have 5i times 5i, but I'm going to rewrite that as 5 times 5 times I, which is 25. And then the i's multiplied together gives me I squared. Now remember from your notes, I squared is very special. I squared is actually represents negative 1. So in my last step, I'm going to rewrite this. That's 25 times, not I squared, but times negative 1, which is negative 25. So in this case, even though we had an I to begin with, since it was being squared, it turned into a real number. And then we can say this is real. Okay, so I is imaginary, but I squared is actually real since it's negative 1. Okay, last problem. I want you to notice the difference between D and B. In letter D, the negative is outside the square root. And this actually breaks down, if I do this guy, it breaks down to the negative, I'm keeping it outside, and then square root of 100 is 10. Well, negative 10 is a real number. You might say, but Miss Name, last time we had a negative, it was imaginary. How come this time it's real? Well, remember, last time our negative was inside of the square root. So that's I. This time our negative is outside. So that's just our regular old negative numbers like negative 3, negative 8, and so on. Those are real numbers. So try these ones yourself. Pause the video right now. Classify them as real or imaginary. Okay, so the first one you should have chosen imaginary because that I does not go away. It's just a real number times I. The second one you should have also chosen imaginary. Since it's inside the square root, that turns into I. And then the square root of 64, which is actually 8i. So that one's imaginary. This one you should have recognized. My negative is outside, so it's actually just a negative real number, negative 8. And then over here, you should have done a little bit of math. That's 2i times 2i, which if I group my whole numbers together, and my imaginary together looks like this. Well, 2 times 2 is 4, and I times I is I squared. And I squared really represents negative 1. So the answer here was negative 4, which is real.